What if I told you that Islam, a religion followed by nearly 2 billion people, was all an elaborate lie? A fabrication cooked up over 1,400 years ago by the people you'd least expect, ancient Jewish sects. There's a wild theory online that claims the Pharisees and Sadducees, the ancient rivals of Jesus, secretly invented Islam for one explosive reason: to deny that Jesus Christ was the Messiah. It's one of the most provocative accusations in religious history. So, is this the biggest conspiracy ever pulled off, or a dangerous fabrication in its own right? Let's investigate.
All right, to get to the bottom of this, we first have to understand the accused. Who exactly were the Pharisees and Sadducees? If you've read the New Testament, their names are probably familiar, often showing up as the primary antagonists to Jesus. But their real story is way more complex. Both groups were influential Jewish factions during the Second Temple period, a volatile era that ended dramatically when the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. They were the intellectual and political power brokers of their time, but they were also bitter rivals, disagreeing on pretty much everything about how to live a Jewish life. Think of the Sadducees as the old money aristocratic elite. They were the priestly class, tied to the power and rituals of the temple. Theologically, they were strict constitutional originalists. They accepted only the written Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and rejected newer ideas that weren't explicitly mentioned, like the resurrection of the dead or the existence of angels. For them, life, religion, and power revolved around one place: the temple. The Pharisees, on the other hand, were different. They were mostly middle-class scholars and businessmen who had the respect of the common people. They believed in an oral Torah, arguing that God gave Moses not just the written law, but also a set of oral interpretations to help future generations live by it. This made them more adaptable and allowed them to embrace beliefs like resurrection, divine judgment, and angels. In fact, Rabbinic Judaism, the foundation of almost all modern Judaism, grew directly out of the Pharisaic tradition. So you've got 2 major rivals: the Sadducees, a wealthy priestly class focused on the temple, and the Pharisees, a popular scholarly class focused on interpreting the law for daily life. They were locked in a battle for the soul of Judaism, and then a new voice emerged that challenged them both: Jesus of Nazareth.
Why invent a whole religion? According to the conspiracy theory, both the Pharisees and Sadducees saw Jesus as a common enemy. His teachings threatened their authority, and his claim to be the Messiah undermined their entire religious framework. They even managed to set aside their rivalry long enough to see him condemned, but the story didn't end there. Jesus' followers started preaching his resurrection, a direct contradiction of Sadducean belief and a radical reinterpretation of prophecy that the Pharisees rejected. And as Christianity began to spread, this is where the conspiracy claims to find its motive. The argument goes like this: since they couldn't stop Christianity at its source, the Jewish sects decided to play the long game. They would create a new, competing religion with a new prophet that would co-opt the story of Jesus, but twist it just enough to serve their original goal. This new religion, Islam, would honor Jesus, or Isa, as a prophet and even accept his virgin birth. But, and this is the crucial part, it would fundamentally deny his divinity, his crucifixion, and his resurrection. In Islam, Jesus is a great messenger, but he is not the Son of God, and he did not die for the sins of humanity. These are the very tenets of Christianity that the Pharisees and Sadducees rejected from the start. So the motive is a theological counterattack. A compelling, almost cinematic plot. But here's the thing about any good investigation: a motive isn't enough. You need the means and the opportunity. And this is where the entire theory completely unravels. Let's put on our investigator hats. For this conspiracy to work, the Pharisees and Sadducees needed the means to project their influence across centuries and the opportunity to plant a new religion in a distant land. The historical record shows they had neither. The first and most glaring problem is the timeline. The Pharisees and Sadducees were powers in Judea before their world was shattered in 70 AD, when the Romans crushed Jerusalem and destroyed their sacred temple. With the temple's destruction, the Sadducees vanished. Their entire identity was tied to temple rituals. Without it, they ceased to exist. They're a historical casualty. The Pharisees, with their focus on synagogues and law, were able to adapt, and their teachings evolved into rabbinic Judaism. But the powerful sect that rivaled Jesus also ceased to exist as a distinct political entity. Now consider Islam. It was founded in the early 7th century by the Prophet Muhammad in Arabia. Muhammad's first revelation is dated to 610 AD. Do the math. There is a gap of over 500 years between the disappearance of the Sadducees and the decline of the Pharisees and the birth of Islam. How could a defunct group and another that had completely transformed orchestrate a complex movement half a millennium later? The second problem is geography. The Pharisees and Sadducees operated in Judea. Islam emerged hundreds of miles away in Mecca and Medina, a different world with its own culture and politics. There's zero historical evidence of some secret cabal of Judean scholars maintaining a 600-year conspiracy and then launching it in a completely different society. Finally, there's the theology itself. While the theory points to Islam's denial of Jesus' divinity as proof, it ignores the vast differences. The Qur'an presents itself as a final revelation from God to Muhammad. Many of its stories that parallel Jewish scripture are closer to post-biblical oral traditions, known as Talmud and Midrash, but with unique twists that suggest oral transmission, not a scholarly plot. So, the means and opportunity just aren't there. The timeline is impossible, the geography is implausible, and the theology doesn't really fit.
If you appreciate digging into history and cutting through the noise like this, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. We unpack complex history and controversial claims every week, and your support helps us keep doing it. So if Islam wasn't a Pharisaic fabrication, where did it come from? The historical consensus is that Islam arose from the specific conditions of 7th century Arabia. The Arabian Peninsula was a vibrant crossroads of cultures, home to polytheistic Arab tribes, but also to significant Christian and Jewish communities. The ideas of monotheism, prophecy, and scripture were very much in the air. According to Islamic tradition and historical scholarship, Islam begins with a merchant from Mecca named Muhammad. Around the year 610, he began receiving what he believed were revelations from the one God, Allah. These revelations called for a return to the pure monotheism of prophets like Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, and a rejection of the idol worship common in Mecca. This message wasn't immediately popular. It threatened the economic order of Mecca, which profited from pilgrimages to the Kaaba, then a shrine filled with pagan idols. Facing persecution, Muhammad and his followers migrated to Medina in 622. This event, the Hijra, marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar and the formation of the first Muslim community. Over the next decade, the revelations continued and were later compiled into the Qur'an. By his death in 632, Muhammad had united most of Arabia under the banner of Islam. The evidence points not to a foreign conspiracy, but to an indigenous Arabian monotheistic movement. Some scholars, like Fred Donner, even propose that the early movement was an ecumenical community of believers, which may have included pious Jews and Christians, all united by a core belief in one God, before it later crystallized into the distinct religion of Islam. This suggests a story of interaction and evolution, not a secret plot. Okay, so we've deconstructed the conspiracy. The theory that Islam was a fabrication of the Pharisees and Sadducees is itself a fabrication. But that raises a final crucial question. Why do theories like this stick around? They're compelling because they offer simple, dramatic answers to complex questions. The rise of a world religion is a messy, complicated process. A story about a secret plot is just easier to grasp. It also feeds confirmation bias, resonating with people who might already hold negative views about one or all of these religions. And like any effective conspiracy theory, it contains a tiny grain of truth. There are deep historical and theological connections between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They are all Abrahamic faiths, The Qur'an frequently engages with and critiques the beliefs of Jews and Christians. But this is a story of influence, dialogue, and debate, not fabrication. It's the story of three distinct religions growing out of a shared cradle, each defining itself in relation to the others. Recognizing these real complex interactions is far more rewarding than falling for a baseless conspiracy. The real history is always more interesting than the fiction. In the end, we're left with a theory that crumbles under the weight of a 600-year gap. The evidence just isn't there. But this leaves me with a final question for you. Why do you think theories like this are so powerful and persistent, even when facing so much evidence to the contrary? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to understand the real historical relationship and the fascinating debates between early Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, you won't want to miss what we have coming up next. Thanks for watching.